The alarm clock rang at 6 a.m., as it always did, its shrill tone cutting through the stale air of Nathan's apartment. He lay there staring at the ceiling, unable to summon the strength to move. His chest rose and fell with the dull rhythm of someone alive in body, but not in spirit. The light creeping through the blinds revealed a room littered with unopened mail, dishes stacked in the sink, and a suit jacket draped carelessly over a chair. Nothing in the room was chaotic, but everything whispered of neglect. When he finally rose, the motions were automatic. Coffee brewed, toast burned slightly, the television flickered with morning news he didn't hear. His hands moved with the memory of routine, but his mind remained elsewhere, adrift in a fog. Walking to the bus stop, he caught his reflection in the glass of a closed shop. The face staring back looked older than his years. The skin was pale, the eyes dim, shoulders slumped. He turned away quickly, ashamed at how far he had drifted from the man he once imagined he would be. At the office, the fluorescent lights hummed above rows of grey cubicles. The screen blinked with unread emails and unfinished reports. Colleagues walked past, some with forced smiles, others with hurried steps. Nathan sat at his desk, fingers hovering above the keyboard, unable to begin. The sound of typing all around him only deepened his stillness. Hours passed, yet he barely moved, his body present but his mind paralyzed. By afternoon, the weight of unspoken disappointment, his own and that of others, settled heavily on his chest. That evening, he returned home to silence. He dropped his bag on the floor and sat on the edge of his bed, still in his work clothes. The city outside carried on, car horns in the distance, footsteps in the hallway, but none of it reached him. He glanced at the pile of unopened letters, utility bills, credit card statements, reminders of responsibilities he no longer had the energy to face. The room seemed to close in on him, the air thicker, heavier. He lay back and stared at the ceiling, the light bulb casting a faint yellow glow. Time stretched endlessly, and in that stillness came the quiet realization he was no longer living, only existing. Not through any single failure, but through the slow accumulation of days that drained him of hope. The recognition was not explosive. It was hollow, echoing, like hearing a final verdict in an empty courtroom. And yet in that lowest point, there was no outcry, no tears, just the undeniable truth that something had to change, or else nothing would. The days began to blur together, each one resembling the last with an unnerving sameness. Nathan rose, dressed, and went through the motions, but his spirit moved slower than his body. Time no longer felt like something measured by clocks, but by fatigue. Mornings carried no freshness, only the heaviness of surviving another night of shallow sleep. In his apartment, silence reigned. The television stayed off, music collected dust in playlists, and books sat unread on the shelf. He had once been a man who enjoyed laughter, who filled spaces with energy, but now his world was muted. He sat for hours with the curtains drawn, the dim light leaving his room in shades of grey. Meals were mechanical, boxes from the freezer, eaten without taste or attention, the fork moving only because his body required fuel. At work, the silence grew heavier, even amidst noise. Colleagues laughed by the coffee machine, shared updates, and leaned over cubicles to exchange small talk. Nathan's replies were nods, brief smiles, never more. His desk became a fortress of paperwork and unfinished tasks, a barrier between himself and the world. His phone lit up with calls he never answered, texts he left unopened, invitations he ignored. He convinced himself no one would notice if he stayed quiet long enough. Nights were the worst. Darkness stretched endlessly, and the stillness of his room turned oppressive. He lay awake, staring at the faint shadows dancing on his ceiling, his body tired, but his mind restless. The thought crept in, quiet at first but persistent. What if this was all there would ever be? The idea of giving up lingered like a shadow at the edge of his vision, never shouting, but whispering constantly. And yet, buried beneath the despair, there was something else. It was not hope, not yet. It was smaller, more fragile. It was a refusal, almost imperceptible, to fully surrender. In the middle of the night, when thoughts pressed hardest, Nathan sometimes clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened, not out of anger, but as if holding onto something invisible. The silence weighed heavy, but somewhere deep within, there was a faint resistance, a voice without words, insisting, not today, not yet. It was not a victory, not even progress, but it was survival, and survival was enough to carry him, one more day at a time. The shift came not with fanfare, but with hesitation. One morning, Nathan woke with the same heaviness pressing on his chest. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, the silence of his room threatening to swallow him whole. But unlike the days before, his eyes fell on his old pair of running shoes tucked in the corner, covered in dust. They seemed foreign, relics of a version of himself that had once moved freely, a man who had believed in possibility. With no clear reason and no plan, he pulled them on. The laces felt stiff, the soles unfamiliar, but there was something almost ritualistic in tying them. He stepped outside, and the air greeted him with a sharp bite of morning chill. It filled his lungs in a way that coffee never had, clean and unfiltered. His first steps were unsteady, as if the pavement itself might give way. He walked slowly, each movement deliberate, like testing the ground for strength. He made it only to the end of the block. His body wanted to turn back, and his mind supplied 100 reasons to do so. Fatigue, pointlessness, the mocking thought that a short walk would change nothing. But he stood there anyway, hands in his pockets, watching the world move without him, neighbors driving off to work, a woman jogging past with her dog, leaves scattered in the gutter. For a moment he felt painfully invisible, yet in that invisibility something stirred. His heart, beating faster than it had in months, reminded him that he was still alive. The ache in his legs told him he had moved, however slightly, against the tide of his own despair. When he returned home, nothing looked different. The curtains were still drawn, the unopened letters still waiting, the silence still heavy, but inside there was a shift, so faint it was almost imperceptible. The next day, he walked again. This time, a little farther. The pavement no longer felt like resistance, but like a path. Each step became less about distance and more about defiance, proof that he was not completely consumed. It was not joy he felt, not yet, but a quiet relief, a sense that movement, however small, could loosen the chains of stillness. He wrote down a single sentence in his neglected journal that night. I moved today. It was only 3 words, but they carried the weight of survival and the first fragile whisper of change. The changes did not come quickly, nor did they come without struggle. Nathan still woke some mornings with the weight of exhaustion pulling him back under, but there was now a rhythm forming. After weeks of hesitant steps, his walk stretched longer. He began to notice small things he had once ignored. The sharp fragrance of rain on pavement, the way sunlight slanted through bare branches, the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes. The world, muted for so long, was regaining color, sound, and texture. One evening, he found his old journal buried in a drawer. The pages were yellowed at the edges, filled with fragments from a younger man, dreams, half-finished sketches, words scribbled with urgency. At first he only flipped through them, his chest tightening at what he had lost. But soon he took a pen and began to write again. The sentences were short, sometimes incomplete, but they carried a pulse. Slowly his thoughts became less scattered. Writing became a ritual, a way to anchor the chaos inside. His body, too, began to respond. He ate with more intention, not grand meals, but food chosen with care. Sleep, though still restless at times, deepened enough that mornings no longer felt like punishment. He cleared a small corner of his apartment, a desk with only his journal, a lamp, and a plant he bought on impulse from a street vendor. The plant thrived with quiet resilience, a living reminder that growth was possible, even in confined spaces. Work remained demanding, but something had shifted in how he carried himself. He no longer avoided the eyes of his colleagues. He greeted them with a nod that was genuine, even if faint. Some days he completed only the smallest of tasks, but he learned to measure progress differently, not by the size of the accomplishment, but by the fact that he showed up and did what he could. There were setbacks. Days when the silence returned, when the journal stayed closed, when the shoes gathered dust again. But he no longer saw these moments as defeats. They were pauses, not endings. And in those pauses, he reminded himself of the simple truth. He had pressed on before, and he could press on again. It was not triumph he carried now, but steadiness. And steadiness, he realized, was enough to rebuild a life piece by piece. Months had passed, and the man who once drifted through days like a ghost now moved with quiet purpose. Nathan stood in front of the mirror one morning, brushing his teeth as he had done countless times before, but this time he paused. His reflection still bore the same lines, the same tiredness around the eyes, yet there was something different. His shoulders no longer sagged with invisible weight. His gaze, once clouded and vacant, carried steadiness. He looked like a man who had survived himself. The changes were subtle, almost unremarkable to anyone else. His walks had become longer, stretching into small jogs on certain mornings. His journal filled with pages of thoughts, goals, and reflections, not polished words but honest ones. His kitchen no longer carried the stale scent of neglect, but the aroma of meals prepared with patience. The plant on his desk had grown taller, leaves spreading outward as if reaching for him. It had become a silent witness to his persistence. There were still hard days, nights when sleep would not come, mornings when silence pressed heavy against his chest, but these no longer defined him. He had learned that strength was not the absence of struggle, but the willingness to continue despite it. Every step he took outdoors, every word written in his journal, every small act of care was evidence that he had chosen life over surrender. One evening, he found himself standing at the window, watching the city below. Cars moved steadily along lit streets. People hurried home, lights flickered in apartment windows. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel separate from it all. He felt part of the movement, not as someone racing ahead, but as someone walking steadily forward in his own lane. The life he had rebuilt was not extraordinary by the world's standards. It did not make headlines, nor did it erase the scars of the past, but it was alive. It was his, and in that quiet truth lay the transformation. He had reclaimed himself from silence, from stillness, from despair. He no longer needed to chase greatness or perfection. The act of pressing on, step by step, day by day, was the becoming, and in becoming, he found what he thought he had lost forever, the ability to live with meaning.